Disney's Cruella, the novelization.
Chapter 22.
Cruella was on cloud nine. Her show had gone off perfectly. Even if the police had caught wind of it, they hadn't gotten there in time to wreck her final appearance. She knew that somewhere the Baroness had been watching. That had been her plan all along. And she just wished she could have seen the look on the woman's face when she appeared wearing her Dalmatian coat. She knew that Jasper and Horace were probably angry at her for not joining them and going back to the lair, but she didn't care. She was too wired to sleep, too happy to face their sour faces and words of warning. She knew that she was facing off against a monster and should be careful, but that night she just wanted to relax. Her stomach growled. And eat, she added to herself. She wanted to relax and eat. Glancing down the street, she saw an Indian restaurant with the open sign still on. Perfect. She headed over and took her place in line. It was surprisingly busy for the middle of the night. She noticed a TV on in the corner. A news anchor was breaking into the nightly news. Cruella watched the bulletin with interest. "In the biggest fashion scandal since Yves Saint Laurent was accidentally declared dead," the anchor was saying, "the Baroness Von Hellman has cancelled her show after a swarm of moths ate her entire collection." Estella smiled. She was still pleased with that move. No one could have ever expected that she would know a species of moth that encased itself in a glittering bead cocoon. If she could have, she would have patted herself on the back. As it was, her hands were now full of Indian food, so she instead turned her attention back to the TV. "Maybe the moths knew something," the fashion reporter said, "because the House of Baroness is looking positively old and musty next to tonight's explosion of new culture icon Cruella, in what can only be described as a fashion riot in Regent's Park." Estella didn't need to hear any more. New couture icon? Brilliant. It was everything she had dreamed of and more. It couldn't have worked out better. The thought made her feel momentarily guilty. She wouldn't have been able to do it without Jasper, Horace, and Artie. Turning back to the counter, she ordered some more food. They might be mad, but who could stay mad when she brought home Indian? Floating out of the restaurant and down the street, she quickly made her way back to the lair. She couldn't wait to see the boys. She wanted to hear everything. Who had they seen? What news did they have? How did they get away without getting noticed? The bags of takeaway swung by her side, and she had to restrain herself from skipping up the stairs when she got to the lair. She pushed open the door and lifted her arms triumphantly. "The Queen is dead! Long live the Queen!" As she flicked on the lights, her voice trailed off. Horace and Jasper were tied to chairs, their hands bound, and their mouths gagged. The flesh around Horace's eyes was turning purple, and blood was caked in the corner of his mouth. He had clearly been beaten up. Behind them stood two big men, their fists clenched, their expressions cold. "Cruella." Hearing her name, or rather her other name, Estella slowly turned. The Baroness stood behind her, flanked by the Dalmatians. Lights from the large window cast her face in shadow, but Estella could feel the venom pouring from the other woman. In the cage they had used to transport the Dalmatians, Buddy and Wink now whined nervously. Clearly, the woman had put two and two together and followed Jasper and Horace back to the lair, and after all their careful planning, they had been caught. "Wow," Estella said when she had collected herself. There was no use pretending to be nice or subservient anymore. "You really are a psycho." "Why, thank you," the Baroness said. "Nice of you to say. You showed promise." As did Estella. Estella saw that the Baroness was clutching her red wig. Estella's eyes shifted from the Baroness to her friends. They were watching, nervous and a bit scared. She didn't blame them. They all knew what the Baroness was capable of, but she wasn't going to back down without a fight. "This is between us," she said. "Let Jasper and Horace, imbeciles that they are, for letting you follow them, go." She heard her friends protest behind their gags, but she ignored them. They had to know she wasn't really upset. She was scared. The Baroness shrugged. "Oh, I will," she said. "They'll be going to prison." "For what? Dog napping?" Estella cracked. The corner of the Baroness's mouth lifted, and amusement seemed to fill her eyes. The look made Estella nervous, and rightly so. "Your murder," she replied, correcting her. "No one will believe that," Estella said, though she knew she didn't sound convincing. "Well, we'll have to add your charred body to the mix to help the believability factor," the Baroness said with a shrug. As she spoke, one of the bodyguards came around from behind Jasper and Horace and grabbed Cruella. While she struggled, the other bodyguard dragged Horace and Jasper out of the room. Estella was helpless to do anything as the bodyguard slammed her into a chair and tied her down. With Estella and the boys secured, the bodyguard grabbed big containers of gasoline and sloshed the liquid over the floor, furniture, and walls of the lair. It would take only moments for the place to go up in flames once the match was lit. "You're going to kill me because I upstaged you?" Estella asked, struggling against her restraints. "Uh-huh," the Baroness replied. Beside her, the Dalmatians struggled on their leashes, trying to get to Buddy and Wink. It was heartbreaking to watch, and for a moment Estella felt bad for the creatures. They weren't evil. Their owner was. With a shout, the Baroness jerked them back and ordered them to sit. Estella shook her head. She was about to be aflame. There was no reason not to put all the cards on the table. "I know you killed my mother," she said. She waited, expecting astonishment to cross the Baroness's face. Instead, the woman just gave her a blank look. "You'll have to be more specific." "What?" Estella said, shocked. Did the woman mean to imply she had killed other people? Apparently so. "Who, exactly?" the Baroness said. "You'll need to narrow it down for me." "On the cliff," Estella said. "You called your dogs on her." The Baroness nodded as she made the connection. "Okay, I'm with you now," she said. Then she shrugged. "So you're peeved about that. Hence the show you've put on?" Estella blinked rapidly. Just when she thought the Baroness couldn't get worse, she did. The woman was a terrible human being. A monster with no conscience. Rage and sadness rushed through Estella in equal measure. How different would her life have been if she and her mum had just never gone to see the Baroness? The rage took over, and Estella pulled at the rope against her. "I'm going to kill you!" she screamed. "And your dogs!" The Baroness reached into her pocket and pulled out a lighter. In one smooth move, she flicked it, and a flame burst from the top. "I'm waiting," she said. A sense of calm filled Estella as she watched the woman holding the flame. It was mesmerizing and powerful to know that there was nothing she could do or say, now, that would matter. Her life would go up in flames, so she might as well mess with the Baroness as much as she could until then. She looked at the security guards. "Would you gents let me go for a moment?" she asked. "I'm sure she's a terrible boss. I'd like to offer you both a new position. Full medical, 4 weeks holiday." No surprise, the men started to think about it. Seeing their looks, the Baroness shouted, "Enough!" She stared back at Estella, her eyes lingering on the girl's black and white tresses. "Just double-checking. That is your natural hair color?" "Yes," Estella said. "Why?" "No reason," the Baroness said. Then with a flick of her wrist, she sent the lighter into the middle of the gasoline. Flames rose up instantly. "Goodbye, Cruella." She turned to one of the guards and ordered him to tip off the press. Then as the flames grew, she added, "I'd love them to know you went out in a blaze of glory." With a wave of her hand and a tug on the leash, the Baroness left, dragging the Dalmatians with her, and leaving Estella to die. Estella coughed and choked as smoke filled the air. It was one thing to act bold and brave in front of the Baroness, but it was different when faced with fire. The lair was an inferno. Through the thickening black, Estella watched in horror as her work went up in flames. The costumes she had made over the years, the sketches she had dreamed up at night, the furniture she and the guys had painstakingly dragged up to help make the place a home. It was all being destroyed, and soon Estella would join it. She thought of Jasper and Horace and Wink and Buddy, her family. They were going to be destroyed too. The boys would go to jail, and the dogs would die. All because of her. Coughing, Estella fought to stay conscious, but it was too hard. Her eyes began to close, and her breathing became shallower. Struggling to open her eyes, she saw that Buddy and Wink, through the bars of their cage, were trying to help her, biting and gnawing at the ropes that bound her. Then she spotted something in the flames, glinting from a pile of poop. She tried to shake her head and clear her vision, but the movement was too much for her. She slid into unconsciousness, but just before the darkness completely took her, she could have sworn she felt arms wrap around her and lift her into the air. She tried to speak, but no words came. Instead, she let the darkness envelop her. Estella's throat hurt. Her eyes burned, her body ached. Her lungs felt like they were on fire, and it felt like dirty water was being swiped across her face. Slowly and carefully she opened her eyes. Buddy was beside her, licking her face, while Wink sat on top of the couch she was lying on, his little face looking worried, and he whined when he saw her. She sat up, a fresh wave of pain flooding through her body and lungs as she took a shaky breath. Where was she? It was definitely not the lair. In a flash, she remembered the flames and the Baroness's evil laugh as she left her to die. So what had happened? The room she was in was cozy and warm, the colors muted and decidedly male. Hearing footsteps, Estella pushed nervously back against the pillows. She was too weak to fight or run. A moment later, the Baroness's valet, John, appeared in the door to the living room, a cup in his hand. "Tea, Miss Cruella," he said when he saw she was awake. Estella shook her head. Was she still unconscious? "You?" She sat up, grabbing her jacket, which had been placed over her like a blanket, and hugging it to her chest. "Why? Why am I alive?" "Because I dragged you out of the flames and smoke before they consumed you," he said simply, as though that explained everything. But it just left Estella with more questions. "Why?" she asked again. "You work for her." John sighed and sat down on a chair across from Estella. He leaned back, legs crossed. In his cozy flat, he seemed different. He was gentler, Estella realized, and not nearly as scary. She waited for him to answer, her mind racing with this sudden change in dynamics. Finally, he spoke. "I knew your mother, and—" His voice got tight. Estella stared at him. He had known her mother? Again, she had questions, but he went on. "I couldn't let that happen. I have something for you." Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out her mother's necklace, which sparkled as it dangled from his fingers, and offered it to her. "You found it!" Estella gasped, taking it delicately in her hand. He nodded. "In the fire. I assure you it has been bleached repeatedly." He gave Estella a smile. "May I show you something?" He held out his hand. Estella passed the necklace back to John. Carefully, he began to unscrew the top of the locket. A moment later, there was a click, and he pulled out a small, thin key. "I didn't know it had a key," Estella said, shocked. "What's it for?" John didn't answer right away. Instead, he took the key and made his way to the fireplace. Taking down an antique box, he carried it over and placed it down on the coffee table in front of Estella. He handed her the key. "This," he said. Estella hesitated and then slipped the key inside the lock. It fit. As she turned, the lock popped open. Lifting the lid, Estella saw a birth certificate. She scanned the paper and saw the words "baby girl," and beside mother, the name Baroness Von Hellman. "The Baroness has a kid?" Estella asked, shocked. John nodded. "Yes," he said. "You." "Me what?" Estella asked, using the words to give her brain time to catch up with John's statement. Was John messing with her? Was this part of the Baroness's plan? Let her think she was going to die, and then have her lackey tell her that her whole life was a lie? But looking up, she saw that John's face was very serious. This wasn't a joke, or at least not the funny kind. Let me walk you through it. Closing the lid, John took a deep breath. The Baroness never wanted children, he explained. She's a true narcissist. She can't love anything but herself. She'd lied and cheated to get the old Baron to marry her. That part Estella could believe. She imagined the Baroness, young and beautiful, charming her way into the Baron's heart and wealth. John went on. So when she found out she was pregnant, she was far from happy. The Baron was so excited about the coming baby that he changed his will, left everything to the child. Estella knew that wouldn't have set well with the Baroness, not if what she wanted was the money all to herself. But to believe that she was the daughter of the Baron and Baroness Von Hellman? It didn't make sense. It just couldn't be. John saw the look of doubt in her eyes. You are her daughter, he said. I was there when you were born. He had watched on the dark, stormy night as Estella came kicking and screaming into the world. The Baron had been away on business, and the Baroness had used that to her advantage. She had barely even looked at the child before ordering John to take care of it. So he had. He had brought the crying baby out of the room and done the only thing he could think to do. Give the baby, Estella, to one of the housemates, a young woman named Catherine. When Estella heard her mum's name, her eyes welled tears. In the dark of the night, John had given Catherine what little money he had, and the necklace, and told her to go, make a new life for herself and the baby, as far away from the mansion as she could get. When the Baron returned, the Baroness told him the child had died. That's what she expected of me, John said softly, his voice full of emotion. So I let her believe it was true. The old Baron, he wasted away. Some say it was grief. Estella's heart ached. So much sadness and death had been caused because of her, and she had never known any of it. She wanted to reach out and hold John's hand, find any human connection, but the man was lost in the memory and his own grief. After he died, the Baroness discovered he never changed his will back, but since everyone thought you were dead, it went to her instead. He stopped, his story almost over. He looked up and met Estella's eyes. The point I'm trying to make is that you are the rightful heir to the Baron's entire fortune. The mansion, the title, everything. For a long moment, Estella just stared at John. Her mind was racing, her heart breaking. But slowly, anger replaced the sadness. That psycho cannot be my mother, she shouted. I know it's a shock, John said, calm in the face of her rage. He was used to it, after all. Estella got to her feet, her jacket falling to the ground, her eyes blazing. It wasn't a shock. It was a nightmare. She felt her breath coming in gasps. She needed to get out of this room and away from the story she had just heard. As John begged her to stop and stay, Estella ran out the door and onto the street. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to get as far from John as possible. Not that it was his fault. Not really. He had only been trying to help her, but his words kept running through her mind, piercing her heart. She didn't stop until she found herself back at the fountain in Regent's Park. Exhausted, she slumped down on the same bench she had slept on her first night in London. In the early morning, the fountain was not running, so Estella just stared at the still water, wishing her own life was as calm. Her nemesis was her real mother, and her real mother had killed her other mother. It was all so confusing. No wonder her mum, her fake one, she supposed, had always been telling her to tone it down and to try to fit in. She was probably scared all along that Estella would become like the Baroness, cruel and heartless. Estella fought back tears. The whole time, her mum had just been trying to love her into shape. And I really tried to be that, Estella said aloud, her voice soft as she spoke to her mother's memory. Because I love you. But the truth is, I'm not sweet Estella. Try as I might, I never was. As she went on, her voice became steadier, stronger, more self-assured. I'm Cruella. Born brilliant, born bad, and maybe a little mad. That's me. But I'm not like her. I'm better. Getting to her feet, Estella took a deep breath. The truth was out there now. Estella was armed with the one fact that could topple the Baroness. And while she knew the woman who loved her and raised her wouldn't approve, Estella was done trying to be anyone but who she was. Estella was dead. Let everyone think she had gone up in flames. But Cruella was alive. And Cruella was going to avenge, revenge, and destroy the Baroness Von Hellman. For her mum, for the Baron, for John, and for her own lost childhood and the life she might have had.